And then in the next scene you see this model home up for destruction. It's quite an interesting scene symbolically. You see, in the middle of this house here, there's a stained glass window that has a mandala on it. We'll see it more clearly in a minute. And mandala is a sacred symbol of the self. That's the Jungian interpretation. It's a symbol. It's very difficult to describe, but it's a symbol. Music is a mandala, except it's played out across time. So you could say that that thing is the same as music, but it's kind of like a slice of music. It's the same idea. You know, sometimes you see those slow motion or sped up motion videos of a flower unfolding. That's the same. It's the same idea. You can imagine that being set to music, and somehow that would make sense. And the mandala is like a symbol of the unfolding of being, or the source of meaning, or something like that. And it's also a symbol of the self. From the Jungian perspective. And so there you see it more clearly. The kids are starting to burn this place and to trash it, and they're dragging a grand piano down the stairs. The destruction of high culture, about which they're nothing but cynical, because they don't believe that hard work and sacrifice can produce something of any value, and they want to bring it down and destroy it. And that's partly because you can see this in the story of Cain and Abel. Abel is hardworking and everyone likes him, and he makes the proper sacrifices, and so his life goes really well. And that's part of the reason that Cain hates him, and he's jealous and resentful. But worse than that, if you're around someone, if you're not doing very well, especially if that's your own fault, if you're not doing very well and you're around someone who's doing very well, it's very painful, because the mere fact of their being judges you. And so it's very easy to want to destroy that ideal, so that you don't have to live with the terrible consequences of seeing it embodied in front of you. And so part of the reason that people want to tear things down is so that they don't have anything to contrast themselves against and to feel bad. And that's exactly what's happening here. The kids are destroying all of this culture, roughly speaking, because it judges them. The fact that it exists judges them. And I've often thought this about Michelangelo's statue of David, which is this heroic, so David was a shepherd, obviously, and it doesn't sound like much, but back in those times, being a shepherd was a big deal, because there were lions, and you had a slingshot, and so like you got to defend your sheep from lions with a slingshot. So you weren't exactly this like 19th century English guy dressed in a, you know, frilly blue suit. You were tough as a bloody, well, as someone who would go after a lion with a slingshot. It's no joke. Anyways, the statue is very heroic, and you know, you look at that and you think, well, that's the possibility of humankind, but by the same token, it's also what you're not. And so, as well as being an ideal, it's a judge, and every ideal is a judge. So, yes?
Going back to your example of Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
So you're using that as an example to illustrate becoming bitter as a result of not being able to achieve
sure
status as a result
success
of,
even
success as a result of hard work. But in the example of Cain and Abel, like one was a shepherd and the other was a farmer, and the one who
one is, yes, that's right, one,
and
yes,
the one who was a shepherd was the one who was favored.
Yes, that's right.
So was that a result of the hard work, or was that a result of
good question. The stories, well, that's a good question. Those stories are very, very complicated, and the story is very ambivalent about whether Cain is not rewarded because he makes bad sacrifices or because God's just in a bad mood. And I like that. If you read the story, I've read multiple translations of the story, and when Cain comes to God to complain, God basically tells him, look, buddy, before you go about criticizing the structure of reality, you should look to your own inadequacies. He says, sin crouches at your door like a predatory, sexually aroused animal, and you invited it in to have its way with you, and something has emerged as a consequence. So don't be bothering me about my creation before you look to yourself. So there's a very strong hint that the reason that God has not favored Cain's sacrifices is because they weren't of particularly good quality. So, but it is ambivalent in the story, and there is the shepherd versus farmer motif as well. And of course that motif runs through the entire corpus of stories to some degree, especially the shepherd motif. So it's only about a paragraph long, that whole story, and it packs all that into that tiny little amount of space. But the idea that Cain kills Abel to get rid of his ideal and also to punish God, roughly speaking, it's a brilliant story. I mean, these guys who go around shooting up high schools, or shooting up high schools in particular, but you know, they're definitely out for revenge, and what they're revenging themselves against or to who is not exactly clear. Anyway, so these kids are just tearing down this model home, tearing down Western civilization, I suppose is another way of looking at it, or just tearing down civilization, period. And Pinocchio's having a pretty good time. He's got his axe and he's looking a little malevolent there, and happy to be destroying things, which is of course a pretty simple thing to do. So there's that image that I told you about, the mandala, and that's a flower in this image. And so what happens is that, I think it's Lampwick throws a brick through it. And so what that means symbolically is the self is a symbol of your potential, among very many other things. But by engaging in this sort of impulsive, destructive activity, Lampwick and Pinocchio are making it impossible for them to further their development. And they're doing that to some degree consciously. You know, they basically say to hell with it, and toss a brick through this highest ideal, the thing through which light shines. So also that harkens back to the star as well. So